Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along and joining us this morning to our live session here at Glasgow Science Centre. This is our Bodyworks Meet the Expert session. My name is Amy. You may have seen me already as you've gone through your Learning Lab resources. I'm so happy to be joining you this morning and welcoming you along live to our very exciting event. We're doing a lung dissection this morning. Which is going to be carried out by our very own presenter, Harriet, which we'll get to meet very, very shortly. Before we hop into the dissection, there's just a couple of things I want to say. So today in our session, like I said, it is going to be a live dissection. We're going to be taking a closer look at a pair of sheep lungs. So live dissections involve cutting up organs and taking a good close look at them. So if you're having a look at the dissection today and you feel maybe a wee bit squeamish, you don't want to watch it anymore, you want to take a break, that's absolutely fine. Please go ahead and do so. And come back if you feel comfortable. That is all good. We are about to meet Harriet in a second, but before we do that, I just want to say if you have any questions for Harriet throughout, what you can either do is post them in the YouTube chat box if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're not watching it on YouTube, you're watching it on the website, you can also tweet us. If you have a Twitter account, you can tweet us at GSC1 with any questions that you have that come up during the session. So please, if you think of any questions, let us know. We'll try and get as many of your questions answered as possible. And with all of that said, I think we're just about ready to hop into the real good stuff of the session, the dissection element with Harriet, and we'll head over to Harriet just now.
Hello, Amy, and hello to all of you watching in your classrooms. Like Amy said, my name is Harriet, and I'm one of the science communicators here at Glasgow Science Centre. And as you can see on the board in front of me is a lovely pair of sheep's lungs that we're going to be dissecting today. Before we do, we need to have a wee think, though, about what our lungs are and what they do for us. So your lungs are located in your chest, just beneath your rib cage, and what they do for us is they pull in air from the atmosphere around us to get all of that oxygen that our body needs to keep going throughout the day. And as they push the air out, when you're releasing your breath, they push out carbon dioxide, all the kind of things that we don't need. So we're going to do that first. We're going to get our lungs working. So I want you to, with me, take a nice deep breath in. Hold it, and out again. So that was your lungs at work. And we're about to follow that journey that the air takes through our bodies. So when we are breathing in, our air is traveling through our nose or our mouth and down our windpipe. So we have the windpipe just here. This is called the trachea. And that is where the air travels down from our nose and mouth into our lungs. So I'm going to cut along this trachea just now. And we're going to have a little look inside. All the way down, nice long trachea on this sheep. So if I cut a wee section out, because there's something that I want you to have a wee look at inside the trachea here. So if we hop over to our lung camera, our specially situated lung camera to have a closer look, can you see the little white edges along the edge of the trachea? They almost look a little bit right now to me like teeth. These are little rings of cartilage, little C-shaped rings of a really firm but flexible material that we have in our bodies. They're not bone. That would be too stiff. If we had bone all the way down our trachea, we wouldn't be able to move our necks. But we need to keep that airway nice and open. It needs to have a bit of firmness, a bit of structure. So our body uses cartilage instead, the same thing that gives our ears and our nose their shape. So the air is traveling down the trachea. We followed it all the way down. As you can see, if we keep going all the way in here, there is a point that looks a little bit like two nostrils. If we look at our lung camera again, can we see these holes here and here? I'm popping my finger in them right now so you can see them really clearly. That is a splitting off point to our two lungs. We call these the bronchi. And if we imagine that our trachea is kind of like the trunk of a tree, and the trunk of a tree splits off into two branches, and those are our bronchi. Now, I am going to follow the bronchi into the left lung. We're going to see where it goes next. So I'm going to cut along this bronchi here into the lung, and you can start to see the texture of the lung. I always thought when I was little that the lungs were kind of like big balloons that just filled up with air, kind of just like empty bags sitting inside your body. But if we take a closer look, we can see all this spongy material. And we've got lots of what it looks like mini bronchi branching off in different directions. You can see all these little holes around here. These are called our bronchioles. So we've gone from our trachea, the trunk of our tree, to our bronchi, the branches of our tree. Imagine the bronchioles like the twigs of those branches. So we're branching off further and further and further into lots of little different crevices inside our lungs. But where does it go next? After the bronchioles, all of that oxygen travels to our alveoli. If we think of this really spongy texture with lots of these teeny tiny little holes, we're thinking of a really microscopic part of the lungs. Imagine almost, if I was to describe how it looks, I would say it looks like a bunch of grapes. All of these little bits clustered together, so teeny tiny, we wouldn't even be able to see them even with our special close-up zoom-in camera. And that is where all of that oxygen goes to travel into our blood, which gets sent all the way around our bodies, pumped by our heart to our different organs. So we're able to get all of that oxygen and we use it for to help create all of that energy, to help release all of that energy that we get from our food, from all the stuff that we need to have a nice, healthy day. So we can see we've traveled from our trachea, our tree trunk, all the way to our bronchi, the branches, into our bronchioles, like the twigs and the branches. And we get to our alveoli. It's kind of like the leaves on those twigs. So it keeps splitting off further and further and further. And that basically means we're getting a lot of surface area to get as much oxygen into our bodies as possible. In fact, lungs are so good at holding air and oxygen that if I cut off a section right here and pop it into a bowl of water, I'm going to put that just in front. Can we see that, cameraman Andy? Yeah? And I was to let the lung float in the water. You see, it can actually float in that water. It's doing very, very well at keeping itself afloat because it is so buoyant and it's got so much space to hold in all of that air. So there we go, pretty incredible. We have here to be able to look at our lungs up close like this. Now, I think Amy has got a little question, but before we get to that, I just remember there's one more thing I wanted to mention about the lungs. One of my favorite parts, we turn them over right here because our lungs aren't doing all of this work by themselves. When we breathe in, there is a really, really strong muscle that is expanding and contracting to be able to get our lungs to fill up with air and release them again. And that is our diaphragm. And we have a little section of our diaphragm right here. You can see this really thin bit of muscle that's attached to our lungs and a little bit attached to our liver. And that is what pulls in the air to our lungs. It expands and it contracts and expands and contracts and gets our lungs to pull in all of that air and push it all out again. There we go. So I think we have a couple of questions. Amy, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, thank you so much, Harriet. That is a lovely thing to watch first thing on a Wednesday morning. I have to say, you've done really well in showing us and explaining the lungs. Thank you so much. We do have some questions. So the first one we want to ask is, these are sheep lungs. How similar or different are they to human lungs?
So sheep's lungs are a wee bit different, not too different. That, you know, our lungs are completely different shapes and sizes and work in a different way. They work in about the same way that humans' lungs do. These may be a little bit smaller than an adult human's lungs, but the most interesting difference is if you see these lungs here, you can see they kind of create these little lobes. They split off into these different sections. We might be able to see in our close-up camera. Can see how we've got a couple of different lobes here and a couple of different lobes here. Now, human lungs also have lobes like this, but we don't have as many. And one of the reasons we think that sheep's lungs might have more lobes than us is that they are evolved to exist at pretty high altitudes. That's their preferred habitat. And that's where the oxygen is a bit thinner in the air. The air isn't as oxygen rich. So you need a lot of surface area to get enough oxygen into your body. And that is one of the differences between sheep's and humans' lungs.
That makes sense. And that's super interesting. It makes me wonder about other animals' lungs and how big they are, but that's something for another day. The next question we want to ask actually is, how does smoking affect our lungs?
So smoking is one of the things that we know is not great for our lungs. Essentially, what happens when you smoke is you're sending a lot of stuff into your body that it doesn't want and it doesn't particularly need. And one of the side effects that that can have is it can make you a bit shorter of breath, but it can also inflame your lungs. And that means your lungs start to produce more mucus to be able to kind of counteract that a little bit. You end up with a bad cough, or you end up getting out of breath. They don't function as well as they want to because they're starting to get damaged a little bit by taking all that smoke.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely something that is not worth getting into at all. We want to have nice, healthy lungs to run about and play and do all the good stuff we do all throughout the day, for sure. When you were cutting into the lungs, actually, it made me think about this question. And I'm wondering, are the left and the right lung exactly the same? Are there any differences between them?
So there are differences in our left and right lungs, and you can actually see them on this pair of lungs right here. Do you notice how one of these lungs is quite thin and long, and one of these lungs is a little bit shorter and wider? So our left lung is a little bit thinner and longer to create room for the heart, and our right lung is a little bit wider and flatter to create room for the liver. So basically, they're slightly different shapes just because of where they sit in our body and what their organ neighbors are doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have to get them fitted in there and sort of be good neighbours with everything else, right? For sure. That's super interesting actually. Everything in our bodies must be really tightly crammed in there. Um Speaking of that, our next question for you is, what other organs do we actually have as part of our respiratory system? I bet they're all quite close by.
Yeah, in fact, we already looked at one of the other organs as part of our respiratory system, our windpipe, our trachea. But if you think about the respiratory system, it's all the things that gets that air into your body. So even your nose and mouth, for example, are part of your respiratory system. And we had a closer look at all the different sections of our respiratory system, like our bronchi and our bronchioles. We even had a look at that muscle at the back of our lungs. That's a very important part of our respiratory system, our diaphragm, because that is the thing that helps pull that air into your body in the first place. Your diaphragm is working very, very hard for you all of the time.
Amazing. My next question actually, as you're standing there doing that dissection, I'm wondering, what does it actually feel like? What does it feel like to hold a lung? How can you describe it?
Well, the trachea itself feels quite like, imagine a tube, like a plastic tube that's kind of corrugated, one that's got all these little lumps and bumps all the way down. It feels a little bit like that. As we go down into the lungs, they feel quite squishy, to be honest. It's not exactly like a sponge. It's a little bit more slimy than that. So yeah, I kind of imagine a bit of a slimy sponge. As I'm feeling them, I can actually feel little air bubbles popping inside of them as well, which is maybe a bit too clear a description for a Wednesday morning.
Yeah, you're making me think when I go home, I'm going to pick up the sponge that's outside of my sink and give it a squeeze, and maybe that feels a bit like a lung. Interesting. I'll think of that when I'm doing my dishes. Um, on that sort of similar vein, I'm wondering, what do they actually smell like?
Ooh, well, I would imagine you're walking down the street and there's a butcher shop and the window's open and it's a really hot day. That is a little bit what they smell like. Or if you have taken some meat out of the freezer because you're cooking it the next day and you forget about it for a little while.
Nice.
It's kind of a meaty smell. It's not off. But it's definitely a smell you have to get used to. The first time I ever did a lung dissection was when we were all practicing a bunch of different science communicators from the Science Centre. We're all learning at the same time. So we were all sat in this room and we had essentially just a big bucket of lungs. And we had to go through them and we had to practice a couple of times. We had to cut down the trachea and cut into the bronchi. And the smell in that room was quite intense. So
I can
one pair of
imagine.
lungs isn't too bad. 10 pairs of lungs, not very pleasant.
10 pairs of lungs. Lovely. I'm going to be dreaming about that later on. 10 pairs of lungs. Nice. Great. Well, those are all the questions that I had for you right off the top of my head. But I believe we've actually had some questions come in via the YouTube chat. So we've got our first question, which is from Christie Park Primary. And the question is, what does vaping do to your lungs? I wonder if you know much about that, Harriet.
Oh, I actually don't know as much about vaping. But thank you, Chrissy Park Primary. That is a really interesting question. So essentially, vaping, it works a little bit like smoking. Any kind of situation where you're sending a lot of hot air into your lungs, a lot of kind of chemicals that you don't necessarily need into your lungs will have some similar effects to smoking. There is some side effects that we're learning about with vaping, and that's, the important thing is we're still learning more about these things and what they can do to our bodies. One of the things I think comes up is popcorn lung, I think is the phrase that I've heard. And I always thought, oh, is it like your lungs start to look like popcorn? But apparently it's because back when microwave popcorn was still new, there was a couple of chemicals in the process of making it that were harmful to people's bodies. And that's essentially where that comes from, where that phrase comes from, popcorn lung, was the chemicals in that microwavable popcorn when it was being made in factories was actually doing damage to people's lungs, the people who are making it. So that's where that comes from. You can look into that a little bit further if you want to. But like a lot of people, I'm still learning about these things.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think because it's relatively new, we don't know all the answers, but I think that scientists are pretty much in agreement that it's not something that you should start doing because it is not good for you. But we just don't
Especially
fully
when we
understand it.
don't know yet what it does to our bodies.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. We're really not sure yet. So it's really not worth taking the chance, I think. It's just like back when smoking started, we weren't exactly sure how that would affect our bodies. Now we know. So I'm sure as time goes on, we'll find out a bit more about it. We have another question from YouTube, and I wonder if we could get that up on the screen. It's another one from Christie Park Primary, and they're asking, if you swallow something very small and your choke reflex doesn't work, what will happen? So I'm assuming they mean if you can't get it out of your body, what would happen then?
Well, if you're swallowing something, it's going down a different pipe I'm taking, are you talking about if you accidentally inhale something? Like if you're eating really fast, you accidentally inhale a bit of food. Yes,
I guess there's a few different ways. Sorry, carry on, Harriet, carry on.
No, it's totally fine. So if it's something very small, it might get lodged in your trachea and it cause a lot of irritation. And also that's where that choke reflex comes from. I do not think it would be rattling about in your lungs. To be honest, is another question that is really, really interesting. And I don't exactly know what the answer would be. Hopefully you've got someone around you who knows the Heimlich maneuver, because whatever happens, I don't think it would be pleasant and I don't think it would be comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good point. If you are eating, you're chewing something, the Heimlich maneuver is good if there's someone there. But I think the best way to just avoid that situation, and the reason why people say this, is chew your food slowly. It's important that you chew your food properly. You don't swallow really big bites because you can choke. Your body does, I believe, have a mechanism to try and stop food from going into your lungs, from going down the wrong way. But if it does go down the wrong way, then like you say, Noah from Christie Park, you start to cough, don't you? And if that doesn't work, then hopefully you've got someone nearby who can do the Heimlich maneuver and help you out a bit. And if not, I think you'd be phoning for the doctor or an ambulance to come and help you out because it would be quite an urgent situation. But it's good to know what to do in that sort of situation.
Yeah.
Find out about the Heimlich maneuver and what sort of things you can do to help someone that's choking. That's good to know.
Because even if it's a small piece of something, imagine that you're drinking a little bit of water and a little bit of it goes down the wrong way. The response your body has is actually quite big, even though
Yeah.
it's a teeny tiny couple droplets of water. So even something small could do a bit of damage.
Yeah, for sure. We have another question actually. And the question is again from Christy Park. Thank you so much, Christy Park. You've got so many questions. This is from Hannah. And it's, how does asthma affect the lungs? Now, Harriet, I don't know if you have asthma and if you know much about it. I do have a touch of asthma, if you want me to chime in, but what do you know about asthma?
So I actually don't know a lot about asthma. It might be best if you give your own experience, Amy.
So the type of asthma I have is not really that severe. I have asthma that's triggered by allergies to things like cats. So when my asthma kicks in, I can feel a sort of tightening in my chest. I'm still able to breathe. I've never had an asthma attack. Like I say, mine is quite mild. But I do have an inhaler to help with it. And what happens, my understanding of what happens, is that you get inflammation in your airway, in your trachea that Harriet was showing us, and it sort of constricts and tightens and gets a bit narrower. And the medication that you take in an inhaler and you puff it in and breathe it in, it just helps to relax that trachea again and make it a bit wider and let the air flow a bit better. So, really, when you have an asthma attack, my understanding is that it's the trachea that's affected. Um, so, there we go. That's how asthma affects your lungs. Um, let's see what do we have next. Um, we do have a question about why the lungs are stretchy from Johnny from Christie Park. Why are our lungs stretchy?
Well, our lungs, you can see, they're a little bit stretchy. They're not really, really, really stretchy. But the reason why they have a little bit of give is because there is a lot of airways packed into here. So they're kind of all like tightening together. But there's a lot of these little tubes and tunnels all the way through them. In fact, your lungs have about 2,400 kilometers of airways in them. And if we were to flatten all of those airways out and have our lungs completely flat, completely smooth, they would cover about the size of a tennis court. So it's stretchy because it's a lot of space, a lot of stuff kind of all smushed up into one little package here. So we've got all of these airways that give us a little bit of stretch, a little bit of give. But as you can see, it's not a whole lot that we have. That helps them to expand when we take in all of that oxygen, which is really important. We want to be making sure that when we take a deep breath, we're getting as much oxygen as possible.
Amazing. Yeah, they do look quite stretchy, don't they? And like you say, quite squishy. Interesting. We do have another really interesting question actually from Christy Park. This is from Mia. And Mia's asking, how do the muscles and brain know how to make oxygen? So I think this is quite a tricky question, a complicated one. And there's a few steps in this process. And maybe Harriet, we can answer this one together. But what do you want to share? Have you got any thoughts on that one?
Well, the first thing is obviously we don't make oxygen. We take it in from our atmosphere around us through breathing, through that process called respiration, when we inhale and when we exhale. We use oxygen in our bodies to help do these kind of chemical reactions to release energy in our cells from the food that we eat. So it's something that our bodies definitely need. But as for the part of the brain that controls all of this, Amy, maybe you can give us a little bit more information about that.
Yeah, well, this function of breathing that your body does is it's involuntary. So that word involuntary means that we don't have to think about it. And that's because this breathing and taking oxygen in is an essential process that happens in our bodies. If you stopped breathing, if you force yourself to stop breathing, your body very quickly tells you that you need to start again. And that's because, like Harriet said, that oxygen that you take in when you breathe is to make energy. That energy that we make with that oxygen it powers everything that happens over your entire body. So this is just really one of these processes that's sort of hardwired into our brains. It's just a sort of instinct. We do it constantly. And that process of making that energy happens in the tiny, tiny little cells that are inside all of our bodies. It's a chemical reaction. So lots of chemicals come together to make that happen. So it's something that just happens all the time automatically. We don't have to think about it. I hope that sort of answers your question. Hope that was clear enough. We do have another question actually that maybe skips back to what you were talking about previously, Harriet. A couple of people have asked this. So we've got Jake and Miley have both asked how big the lungs are and how big they can get when you breathe in.
Oh, well, for how big the lungs are, as an adult, for example, in my body, my lungs would be about the size of a loaf of bread. So they are quite large. In fact, we also have an exhibit here at the Science Centre that lets you inflate the lungs. Now, unfortunately, I've cut into these ones, so I can't quite show you what they look like when they inflate. But they do really get quite big. If you yourselves taking a really deep breath, you can feel how far your chest rises out. And that is all to do with your lungs expanding and getting bigger when you take in a really deep breath.
Yeah, do you know, I've actually just figured this one out, or found out rather, how big your lungs can get. So everyone who's sitting watching this, you know, you get those 2 litre drinks bottles, the sort of big drinks bottles that you get in the shops of fizzy juice. So they're 2 litres. Your lungs, roughly, as an adult, have about 6 litres of air that they can hold. That's quite a lot of air. Obviously, this depends per person, but there you go. That's a sort of average figure. 6 litres of air. It's quite a lot. I think we're coming to the end of our session, unfortunately. We've had some really good questions so far, and I think maybe we've got time for one more question, actually. So we've got a couple of minutes to go. Um, let's see, we've got a few that have come in. Um, oh, this one, this one's an interesting one, actually,
Mhm.
from Cooper from Christie Park. What happens if only one lung works?
So you could survive if you only had one lung. It is possible, but it's not ideal for our body. The reason why we have two lungs is that's how many we need. There's nothing that's necessarily extra in our bodies that we didn't need or don't need at any one point. So it is possible to survive on one lung. Obviously, the amount of oxygen you're taking in will be less. They're not working at full capacity the whole time. So we do want to make sure that we have got two lungs and they are working really well. If you only had one lung, you'd also have to look after it really, really, really well, because that is the only one you've got and you definitely need them.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's just what you're saying, Harry. It's really important to take care of our lungs anyway, but if you only had one, you'd have to really make sure you took care of that. But I gather it is enough to live on one lung. There's a few places in our body that are a bit like that, like your kidneys. You can survive with just one. You can survive with a bit of your liver taken away. But generally, we want to take good care of our bodies because we, like you say, we need all of it to work nice and healthily. Um, Fantastic. Harriet, you've answered so many of those questions there. Thank you so much. And we had some really good ones. Thank you for everyone who submitted a question this morning. We've learned so much in that half an hour. It's been really interesting. I just want to point out before you all go away, this session that we've done this morning, I hope you've enjoyed it. And we've got lots of other really similar sessions on our Curious About website. If you want to take a look at all the other resources and videos and interactive resources that are on there are lots of other Meet the Expert style videos where they're answering questions there for you to watch. You can watch those in class if you fancy it. So please feel free to check it out. The website is scrolling along the bottom of the screen just now. But apart from that, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I hope you've enjoyed this live dissection today, and I hope in general you've enjoyed doing the learning lab and using all the resources in class and taking part. And hopefully we get to see you all very soon here at the Science Centre. But I think we're going to wrap it up. So Thank you so much from me. And Harriet, thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. It's been great. Thank you to you for joining us. And I'll say goodbye, everyone. Bye.